A midnight letter, its words darker than the hour it arrived. Welcome to Fabled Codex. I am your host, Mithrin. Share where you're joining from. I always enjoy discovering our global community. Now the mystery begins. I had returned from a late visit to a patient in Marylebone and found Baker Street under a thick, glistening pall of fog that turned each gas lamp into a blurred yellow coin. The clock of St. George's had scarcely finished striking one when I let myself in with my latchkey and crept, as quietly as habit allowed, up the familiar stairs. Mrs. Hudson's household slept. If only the thin, restless whine of the wind at the eaves kept me company. Yet even before I reached the sitting room, I knew Holmes was awake. His violin, never sweet at such hours, but exploratory, like a mind walking along a precipice, drew a spare, questing phrase, and then fell silent the instant I touched the knob. "You have been 3 hours," he said without turning. "The man with the gout insisted on seeing you to spare his son the expense of a private nurse. A cab dismissed at the corner, either from thrift or to avoid a watcher. Your gloves? Ah, the right one has a faint smudge of graphite near the thumb, which suggests that your patient keeps his accounts himself, and thrust a paper under your hand for a signature. Also, your left boot has a dab of white plaster. Builders in the next house? The sound of a hammer told me so an hour ago." "It is the other way with you, Holmes," I said, throwing my coat over the chair. "When London sleeps, your brain sits up and lights the lamps." "My brain is a poor lamp to set against London," he returned, but there was a gleam in his eye that told me he would not exchange his restless vigil for many lamps. "Come closer. Do not step there, on the bare boards by the door. The dust is not mine, and I am curious about it." Our hearth and table were lit. The Persian slipper on the mantel had been upset and righted again, and on the edge of the table, just within the circle of lamplight, lay a letter, if letter it could be called, that had about it an air of the odd and significant. It was a thick blue-grey envelope, of the sort I have seen used by a few old clubs with a black border no wider than a thread. The address was written in an angular, upright hand, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street, and there the writer had stopped, as if grudging anything beyond necessity. The wax seal was black also, and bore a device of a rook, yes, the chess piece perched upon a battlement. "It came 12:15, said Holmes. "Slid under the door, as you see from the track in the dust you have so considerately left undisturbed. Then the sender avoided the bell," Holmes finished. "One does not wake a house to deliver a letter that wishes to be thought invisible. Observe, Watson, the faint crescent of damp round the edges, fog on the hand of the messenger, and this smear along the left side, where a gloved finger pressed too close to the wet of the wax. India rubber. I scent lamp black and a trace of camphor. A compositor's hand, or one accustomed to ink and the headache of small characters." He slit the envelope with the long forefinger of his right hand. Never, I think, was there a tool more suited to delicate work, and unfolded a single thick sheet inside. A small card dropped unregarded to the table. I stooped to retrieve it. It was plain, without name, bearing only a tiny printed number in the corner. 53 read, said Holmes. The sheet contained 6 lines, printed, not written, with the neat severity of a press. There was no salutation. "By the time you read this, Sir Felix Marchbank will be dead. Do not question the manner of his death. It will satisfy the law, if you would spare a second stroke. Watch the garden window. Midnight will not be the end. Rooks fly in fog. A friend of the second best. There was no signature beyond that perverse sobriquet. At the bottom, beneath the main body, someone had stamped an hour and place as if it were a docket. Southwark, 12:10 a.m. "What in God's name—" I began. "Southwark," said Holmes, ignoring my exclamation, "suggests the river, the printing works, and certain more candid forms of vice. A friend of the second best, a curious mind delights in such rhetoric. The second stroke and second best. Our man has either a pedant's ear for echoes or the practical tunnel vision of a club player. Rooks indeed." He laid the sheet flat and leaned so near that the light glazed his cheek. "You see the faint depression at the end of each line? Hand press. Not a large machine. Hand smell, yes, camphor to keep moths from paper. The edges are not quite square. The sheet was cut against a tired blade. The name, however, had struck me where the nerves lie close to the skin. Sir Felix Marchbank? The philanthropist. I recall his name among those who recently endowed the nautical school at Limehouse. Holmes nodded. Philanthropy is society's most polite curtain. Nothing of itself, but often used. I have had Marchbank in my fingers twice, and let him go for want of proof. A financier with a gift for acquiring other people's difficulties at a bargain and selling them back as blessings. Still, this is not libel hour. It is 1 o'clock. If our unknown prophet is not a madman, then somewhere in St. James's or Belgravia, a very respectable corpse has begun to cool. We had barely time for that grim sentence to settle between us when there came the sharp rattle of a cab on the stones below, followed by a fierce pull at the bell. A door flung open, and Mrs. Hudson's protests died in the tread of brisk official boots. Lestrade of the Yard burst in with the fog on his shoulders and urgency in his eye. "Holmes, doctor. Thank heaven you're awake. Sir Felix Marchbank has been found dead at his house in Queen Anne Street. A seizure, the butler says. Apoplexy, the family physician says. And I say I'll be cursed if I know what I say. There are marks that don't suit a gentleman's natural end." Holmes merely held up the letter. "I have seldom seen a man's face change in so small a compass of time." Lestrade's mouth opened. His hand went by instinct to the pocket where he keeps his notebook, then stopped as if arrested by the words in front of him. "By the time you read this, Sir Felix Marchbank will be dead," he read. "And you receive it when?" 12:15, said Holmes. "You left the house when, Inspector?" 5 minutes to 1. The night footman, going for the doctor, near knocked me into the railings in Harley Street. I thought it queer, the hour and the pace, so I went with him. Sir Felix was on the carpet in his dressing room, a little blood at the mouth and a smell. Well, I don't fancy myself squeamish, Mr. Holmes, but it was not the sick room. It was like a new coin rubbed under the nose. "Metallic," Holmes murmured. "And the garden?" "The garden?" Lestrade blinked. Holmes tapped the third line. "If you would spare a second stroke, watch the garden window." The windows were latched on the inside, the maid said. "There's frost on the panes and no footprints below, bar the old ones from the gardener." The doctor, Marchbank's man, was eager to make it apoplexy, and the family, meaning Lady Marchbank and the daughter, Miss Beatrice, were even more eager. I'll own I was inclined to let sleeping titles lie, but, he pointed to the letter again, this slaps the sleep out of a man. Holmes's eyes had taken on that brightness they assume when mind and senses are in perfect alignment. He moved, quick and noiseless, to the hearth and held the sheet at a careful angle to the fire. "No sympathetic ink," he said. "But here, Watson, the card you picked up, thank you." "A number only. Lestrade, does Sir Felix belong to any club wherein members are identified by numbers on their correspondence?" "The Erebus," Lestrade said promptly. "Makes the gentlemen feel like conspirators." "Marchbank was a pillar there." "Erebus," Holmes said, as if tasting it. "Very good. I think we shall take your cab, Inspector. If the second stroke is to be spared, whatever the devil that may be, we have not many minutes to toy with language. I had my hat and cane in a moment, and together we descended to the street, where the fog now lay in long moving curtains, and the horse's breath smoked against the lamplight. Holmes paused on the threshold, bent, and with a little penknife scraped the thin track of dust where the letter had slid beneath the door. He lifted the grey flower to his nose. "Not London dust," he said. "River silt and a suggestion of sugar. Southwark again, or Blackfriars. There is a sugar warehouse there. Come." The cab rattled away, and Baker Street dwindled behind us like a memory one is not done with. We passed a constable with his cape pulled high, and a drunkard talking to his own shadow. Holmes had the letter open upon his knee, his long fingers smoothing it as a hawk smooths the air. "Rooks fly in fog," he read softly. "There are 3 meanings in that line. I shall be disappointed if there is not a 4th. You credit our unknown with a good deal." "I do him the courtesy he desires," said Holmes. "If he is a fool, he has chosen his bait well. If he is not a fool, he will be waiting to see what the rooks do when they fly. And the second stroke. Either a second death, Watson, or a second attempt upon the same victim's circle. It may be literal, as in apoplexy, or clever, as in chess. I have lost too many games by thinking a rook, and not a stratagem. We shall look to the garden window first, for men who say window often mean door, and men who say friend often mean the reverse. We turned into Queen Anne Street at a pace that made the cabman swear under his breath. Ahead a house stood with its lamps all burning, their light fighting the fog and losing ground. In that wavering halo, a cluster of figures gathered, like moths unsure whether the flame would warm them or devour. As we drew up, the garden to the rear showed a rectangle of blackness against the dim red of a drawn curtain, and in that blackness, for the merest instant, I thought I saw the suggestion of a pale oval, no more than the ghost of a face withdrawn from the window as a hand within lifted the sash. Holmes's hand fell on my sleeve with a pressure that spoke both warning and delight. "Do you see, Watson?" he whispered. Midnight has a long afterglow. Holmes's fingers tightened on my sleeve a second longer, and then fell away as he stepped down from the cab with that noiseless decisiveness which to my mind is half his method. Lestrade sprang after him, calling to the constable at the gate to keep back the curious. The Marchbank house, a handsome Georgian front with a fanlight above the door, wore its distress with a certain propriety. The lamps burned high. The knocker had been muffled, and in the vestibule a butler with a face like a new gravestone hovered between dignity and collapse. I cast one glance to the rear, where the garden showed as a rectangle of deeper gloom beyond the house, and saw only my own doubt answering me from the glass. Inside, a smell met us that made the skin at the back of my neck stir, the compounded odor of hot metal and some acrid essence, overlaid by the faint perfume of a woman's room. Holmes took it in as a hound notes a wind. His eye passed over the hall, the umbrella stand with a damp ring beneath one hook, a lady's wrap thrown hastily over a chair, a smirch on the marble tiles like a heel turned in soot, and then settled on the butler. "Peters," said Lestrade, "these gentlemen, Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, are here to assist. You will answer them as you have answered me." The man inclined his head, and if his voice shook, it did so only once. "Sir Felix retired at 11:30, sir. I carried up hot water at the 11:45 and found him in the dressing-room writing. He bade me set the can by the grate and leave the tray. At 12:05, hearing a bell, I went up again, but it was not master's bell. It was the small hand-bell on the little table by the garden window. Miss Beatrice had rung for her maid." "Ah," said Holmes. "And what did Miss Beatrice require at 12:05? The man's grave face altered by a shade. "She fancied she heard a tap at the garden window, sir. It frightened her. She desired the maid to look. The maid drew the curtain and saw nothing. Then Dr. Verrill, Sir Felix's physician, arrived. He had been sent for earlier in the evening about Lady Marchbank's nerves. He went up to her ladyship. I was on the stair when I heard a cry from the dressing-room. I entered and found Sir Felix fallen forward on the carpet. His hand," he faltered, "his hand on the bell-pull, as if he had tried to summon us and failed." Holmes had listened with his head bent and his fingertips together. He now looked beyond Peters to the staircase that rose shallow and polished to the first floor. "Inspector, if you will give me 3 minutes with the room and 1 with the garden, I shall be grateful. Watson, your nose." "I smelt it at once," I said. "Metallic." "Copper," Holmes returned softly. "And something less honest than copper. Come." The dressing-room of Sir Felix Marchbank was a large, well-appointed chamber lit by 2 lamps and a reading candle that had guttered, throwing a stalactite of wax down its side. Sir Felix himself lay decently covered upon the bed. Someone, likely the daughter, had performed that kindness and smoothed the grey hair back from his brow. There was a small bruise on the cheekbone, as if he had fallen against the fender, and a fleck of dried blood at the corner of the mouth. The physician, a compact man with a neat moustache and anxious eyes, stood by with the air of a practitioner who would prefer the verdict to be simple and the family grateful. "Apoplexy," he announced at once, with that firmness which is meant to ban doubt. I said so to Lady Marchbank. There is a family tendency. Holmes tipped him the briefest acknowledgment and went on his knees by the hearth. He did not touch the body. He examined instead the brass fender, the carpet pile where it was crushed, the ashpan, and the tray with its jug and basin. His head lifted slightly. "Hot water at 11:45, you said, Peters," he called. "Yes, sir." "Why then is there a thin film upon the surface of the water which is not steam, but oil?" "No, do not answer. Dr. Verrill, you perceive the odour." The doctor frowned. "A household polish. These rooms have always some scent or other." Holmes smiled without mirth and rose, his eyes going now to the little table by the garden window. The curtain had been drawn and half pulled back again, leaving a chink on the right-hand side. He set his hand lightly upon the sash, pressed and nodded. "Locked and bolted from within," he said, as Inspector Lestrade reported. "Yet, Watson, your handkerchief." I handed it to him, and he laid the white square along the bottom of the frame, then carefully touched the wood with the point of his knife. A faint smear showed on the linen when he lifted it, a dull grey mark like the shadow of a thumb. "Graphite," he murmured. "And there," he drew a fingernail over the inner lip of the catch, "a ghost of something gritty that is not London soot." "Peters, you keep coal in the cellar?" "Yes, sir." "Not sugar?" "No, sir. Sugar is kept in the pantry." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "We shall visit both before the night is out." "Lestrade, oblige me. Set a man on the mews door and another at the garden gate. No one in or out who has not already done so." We passed then to the bed and the dead man's hand. It had been folded, but Holmes lifted it gently and sniffed. He touched the fingers to his lips as if testing the air. "Do you taste it?" he asked me. "Again, metal," I said, "and a bitterness on the back of the tongue." "Just so. A volatile salt married to a metal. You see the faint green stain on the nail?" "We shall not waste the coroner's time with apoplexy." Dr. Verral bristled. "Sir, forgive me. No slight to your experience. A man may die of apoplexy in 100 ways, and of none at all in 1,000 guises. But this is not a natural end. You will have observed, too, the bell pull. There is soot on it which does not match the grate. The candle has guttered from a draught, though the windows are latched, and there is a soft scraping upon the inner wood of the garden sash, where a tool thin and flat has been drawn and withdrawn 3 times. Now, Miss Beatrice. Now, Miss Beatrice." The name had not been spoken, but it brought a rustle at the door. A young lady stood there, pale but controlled, her dark eyes luminous in a face from which grief had not yet effaced resolve. She was plainly the daughter of the house. Behind her, a woman in a wrapper, Lady Marchbank, leaned upon an arm she scarcely seemed to feel. "Mr. Holmes," Miss Beatrice said, "I know you by reputation. If you can save my mother from the talk that always comes, I will tell you anything." Holmes bowed with a grave courtesy that I have seen him display on only a few occasions. "You rang your bell at 5 minutes past 12, Miss Marchbank. You imagined a tap at the garden window." "I did not imagine it," she returned quietly. "I heard it. 3 taps, light, deliberate, then nothing. I feared—" Her glance went involuntarily to the covered form on the bed. "I know not what I feared." I sent Rose to look. She drew the curtain and smiled and said that nerves make mischief of noises. I did not sleep. "The curtain. Did you yourself touch it?" "No." Holmes went again to the chink, and with his head almost against the fabric, inhaled as a gastronome savors a dish. "Very faint," he said, half to himself, "but present. A man who knows he carries his scent with him hides it where he can. Miss Marchbank, does your father belong to the Erebus Club?" A flicker crossed her face. "He did." "And there is among his effects a card bearing only a number?" She nodded. "In his wallet." 53? Her lips parted. "Yes." "Thank you. One thing more. Has any person in this house besides Dr. Verral lately suffered from headaches relieved by a little draught in a brown bottle?" Lady Marchbank stirred. "I," she said faintly. "Verral sends me. One sleeps so ill—" Holmes's look sharpened but softened again as he turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, the garden." We descended by a back stair, Peters carrying a lantern. The night air struck cold and wet upon the face. The fog had thinned, and the shrubs were beaded with moisture that took the light like dusted silver. Holmes moved straight to the rectangle beneath the dressing-room window and went down upon his hands and knees. The earth there was old, winter-hard and rough with rime. No footprint marked it. He raised the lantern so the glass caught the pane above us. A faint crescent showed at one edge, as if a gloved hand had once pressed there and been wiped away again. "Here," he said softly. "Watson, note the brickwork below the sill. These 2 courses are newer than the rest. The mortar shows a sugar bloom where the mix was adulterated. And in the joint, yes, take that with your tweezers." I did so and held up the prize, a thin shaving of metal curled like a fish scale. "A spring steel," Holmes murmured, and there was a suppressed satisfaction in his voice. "From a rule or a watch tool filed to a particular purpose." Our visitor under the window had a hand not unlike a printer's, ink, graphite, the habit of pressure, and the patience to draw a latch from without marring the paint. He did not enter, however. Something interrupted him. "The cry?" I suggested. "Or the bell," said Holmes. "Or a second hand within the house that was supposed to be friendly and was not. We must learn before dawn which of Sir Felix's virtues was valued most by those who profited by it, and who feared the rook's second move." He straightened, and the lantern light made a sharp profile of his face against the blank of the window. "We will see the pantry now, Watson, and then the physician's bag." He smiled thinly. "Rooks fly in fog, but even rooks must land somewhere." The pantry proved as spotless as Peters's anxious pride had promised. Rows of gleaming jars stood in perfect order. The sugar bin was covered with its linen cloth. Not a grain lay scattered on the floor. Yet Holmes's quick eye went to the corner, where a faint scuff marred the paint on the skirting board. He stooped, touched it, and showed me the tiny glint that came away on his fingertip. "Powdered sugar," he said. "And yet Peters swore the sugar is kept only here, a trace of it upon the garden sash, and now a fleck where no spoon could honestly have fallen. This house has been visited by a hand that does not trouble about Butler's discipline." Lestrade shifted uneasily. "You're telling me someone came into this room tonight?" "Into this room, or left it," Holmes replied. "But let us see what our medical friend carries in his professional armament." We went at once to the parlour where Dr. Verrill had established himself with a look of injured dignity. His bag stood open on the table, the instruments polished, the bottles labelled in neat Latin script. Holmes did not ask permission. He lifted each phial, uncorked it briefly, and replaced it with swift delicacy. When he came to one squat bottle, no larger than my fist, he paused. "This is yours, Doctor. Certainly, a draught compounded for Lady Marchbank's insomnia. Harmless enough, chloral hydrate in light dilution." Holmes tilted the neck and let one drop fall upon his thumbnail. He bent his head close, inhaled, then touched it lightly with his tongue. His eyes sharpened. "Harmless indeed." He set the bottle down. "It is not chloral only. There is a tincture here that does not come from any apothecary I trust. Watson, you taste it." I obeyed reluctantly. The bitterness was unmistakable, not unlike that which had clung to Sir Felix's fingers. Holmes replaced the cork with a little snap. "It is fortunate for Lady Marchbank that she did not drink deep tonight. This mixture has been altered." Verrill coloured. I must protest. I compounded it myself. I would stake my reputation." "You may have to," Holmes interrupted coldly, "but reputation is no shield against substitution. When last did you prepare this draught?" 3 days ago. I delivered it in the same bottle." Holmes nodded as if making a mental note. Then, without warning, he swept the lantern light to the hearthrug, where a faint track of ash had been ground into the pile. "You perceive, Inspector?" A footstep, small, arched, not a man's boot, a slipper. Yet we are told only Sir Felix entered this room before his collapse. Why then do we see a lady's tread so near the fender? Beatrice Marchbank, still standing in the doorway, had gone pale as ivory. "I was with my father before he retired," she said steadily. "I came to ask his advice upon a letter. I wore my slippers, but I left him before the half-hour." Holmes turned the rug with the point of his stick. "There are 2 steps, Miss Marchbank, one fresh, one faint, as if overlaid by falling ash. The second could not have been earlier than the moment of the candles guttering. Forgive me. You, or some woman shod as you are, was here after midnight." A silence fell. Then Lady Marchbank, with sudden dignity, straightened in her chair. "It was I," she said. "Felix rang for me. He had a spasm of the heart. I stood there, and when it passed he sent me back. I had not wished to confess it. I thought it better the world believe he died alone than know his wife lingered helpless beside him." Holmes regarded her a moment, his gaze inscrutable. Then he inclined his head. "Your candour may yet serve you, madam. I make no judgment until the pattern is complete. But mark me, there is more here than a husband's heart and a wife's vigil." Vigil. The clock on the mantel chimed the quarter. Holmes rose swiftly. "Lestrade, we must move." The letter promised a second stroke. If it is not upon Sir Felix, it must be upon one close to him. Where is Miss Beatrice's letter, the one she came to show her father? She drew from her pocket a folded sheet. Holmes opened it and scanned. It was a short demand for payment. couched in harsh legal phrases, signed only with the printed name of a firm I did not know. Holmes's brow furrowed. "Suffolk again," he murmured. "This firm exists more in name than stone. Observe the type, the same hand-press as our midnight warning." He closed it crisply. "We must look to the club, Inspector. Erebus holds the key. Number 53 was Sir Felix, but who is 54? The Rook's second flight is never far from the first." Lestrade swore under his breath. "You mean someone else is marked already?" Holmes drew on his gloves. "Unless we are swift, yes. Watson, fetch your coat. Peters, keep all doors barred. Dr. Verrill, remain by Lady Marchbank. Your honour depends on it. Miss Marchbank, courage! The night is not done." And with that we were in the cab once more. The fog thickening about us, Holmes leaning forward with the letter open upon his knee, his eyes bright with that fire I had learned both to dread and to admire. "The rook flies in fog," he said again, "but the rook flies toward a king. Tonight we shall see if we can castle before it strikes." The cab rattled across the slick stones, the horses' hooves ringing hollow in the muffled fog. Holmes sat taut and forward, his lean fingers pressed together under his chin, while Lestrade muttered beside him about the folly of chasing shadows at 2 o'clock in the morning. I, for my part, was content to watch the play of thought across my companion's features, for I knew well that beneath that mask of abstraction some delicate thread was being woven which, once revealed, would seem inevitable to every eye. "The Erebus Club. Inspector," Holmes said at last, breaking his silence. "Its rosters, its numbers, its inner politics, those are what bind this letter to Sir Felix's end. If 53 has fallen, then 54 is already trembling." Lestrade grunted. "And you think the club will throw open its books for us in the middle of the night?" Holmes smiled faintly. "A death of this magnitude loosens bolts quicker than keys, and if it does not, I have other means. The fog is to our advantage. A rook flies unseen but not unheard." We reached Pall Mall, where the lamps glowed faintly behind their veils of mist, and drew up before a discreet facade whose heavy door bore no sign but a brass knocker, worn smooth by years of privilege. 2 men in capes lounged by the steps, and as we approached, one moved forward with an air of suspicion. Holmes gave his name in that flat, commanding tone which admits no denial, and Lestrade added the authority of the yard. The man hesitated, then stood aside, opening the door upon a hall of muted light and thick carpets. The Erebus Club was not in its most convivial state at such an hour. A single servant moved silently among extinguished lamps, while from the far room came the low murmur of voices and the clink of glass. We were shown there without ceremony, and I confess a twinge of unease as we entered, for the atmosphere seemed weighted with something more than tobacco smoke. A half-dozen gentlemen sat scattered about, some in evening dress, others in slippers and loose coats, their faces turning toward us with curiosity edged by wariness. Holmes's glance swept the room, taking in every detail: the pile of dice on a side table, the faint scatter of cards near the grate, the untouched brandy at a gentleman's elbow. He fixed at once upon a man who sat somewhat apart, his head bowed over a newspaper, though his eyes never left the door. "Mr. Mortlake," said Holmes softly. "Number 54, I think." The man started as if struck, and the paper fell from his hand. He was a lean fellow with hollow cheeks and a restless twitch about the eyes, which darted from Holmes to Lestrade with the look of a hare-sighting hound's. "You mistake me, sir," he stammered. "I am no numbered pawn in your game." Holmes advanced, producing the card that had dropped from our midnight letter. "This bears the mark of your club, Mr. Mortlake. Sir Felix was 53. You are the next in line. Tonight's message spoke of a second stroke. Do you still protest ignorance?" The room had grown tense, every man listening, though none dared interrupt. Mortlake licked his lips. "If Marchbank is dead, it is no sorrow to me. He bled me dry with schemes cloaked as investments. But I swear on my honour, I knew nothing of this warning." Holmes's voice cut like a knife. "Yet you sit here awake at an hour when even gamblers grow weary, with a paper you do not read and a glass you do not drink. You wait, Mr. Mortlake, for what? For whom?" Before Mortlake could answer, the door burst open and a servant rushed in, pale and breathless. "Sir, there is someone in the garden," he cried. "A figure by the back railings, watching." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Come, Watson." We followed him through a passage that led to the rear. The garden of the club opened onto a narrow mews, and through the drifting fog we saw indeed a shadow slip along the railing, halt, and then dart away with surprising swiftness. Holmes was after it in an instant, Lestrade at his side and I pounding behind with my heart thundering. The figure fled down the alley, its cloak flaring, then vanished abruptly into the fog. But Holmes had anticipated the turn. He sprang to the right, and we found ourselves in a cul-de-sac where the air was thick with damp brick and the faint reek of ink. The quarry stood cornered, breathing hard. Holmes advanced cautiously. "You play a bold game, sir, but the rook's flight is finished." The man made no answer. He wore a cap pulled low and a scarf muffled about his throat. His hands, when he raised them, were dark with stains that no laundress could scrub away. Even before Holmes spoke, I knew them. "A printer," he said softly. "The very hand that struck off our letter." Lestrade seized the fellow, who made no struggle, only a low laugh that chilled me more than resistance. "You are too late," he whispered. "The second stroke has already fallen." Holmes's face hardened. "What do you mean?" But the man only shook his head, his teeth showing white in the dim light, and would speak no more. Holmes turned sharply to Lestrade. "Hold him fast and take him to the yard. I must return to Queen Anne Street at once. If his words are true, we may already be one step behind. Watson, quickly!" The cab we had left waited still before the club, the driver drowsing on his box. Holmes roused him with a command that brooked no delay, and we set off again, the fog pressing close, as if eager to smother our haste. Holmes sat rigid, his eyes like flint. "If Mortlake has escaped harm, then the stroke must have fallen elsewhere," he muttered. "But where? Within the house we left, or in some hidden quarter of Marchbank's affairs? Rooks fly in fog, Watson, but the board is wider than we think." The cab clattered on, and in my breast grew the uneasy conviction that whatever waited for us at Queen Anne Street would not be so simple as a family in mourning. For the game we had entered was not of pawns and rooks alone, but of unseen players who moved in silence, striking at midnight and beyond. And Holmes, for all his keenness, was racing not against time only, but against a mind that took a sinister pleasure in keeping him always one step too late. The cab tore back through the fog, like a vessel racing blind upon a midnight sea. Holmes sat forward, his hand drumming once against his knee, then falling still as his gaze turned inward. I had seen that look before, a mind calculating not only possibilities, but the cruel contingencies of failure. Lestrade, jolting opposite us, muttered his impatience, but Holmes gave him no heed. When at last the wheels ground to a halt before Queen Anne Street, the house showed signs of disturbance. A lamp burned in an upper window, the door stood half open, and Peters the butler hurried down the steps with agitation written in every line of his face. "Thank heaven you've come, gentlemen," he gasped. "There has been another alarm. Miss Beatrice, she near swooned in the corridor. She swore someone tried the garden latch again not 20 minutes past. 20 minutes past." Holmes brushed past him, mounting the steps in 2 strides. "Is she unharmed?" "Yes, sir, her maid attended her at once. But her ladyship is in great distress. Dr. Verral is with her now." We entered the hall, and Holmes's sharp glance swept its length. A draught lingered there, bringing with it that same faint acrid odour we had noticed in Sir Felix's chamber. Holmes bent swiftly, touching the marble tiles just inside the door. "A smear," he murmured. "Powder fine as flour. And yet the pantry was clean. Watson, do you perceive the faint sweetness? Sugar again. Our visitor has not abandoned his work. He is toying with us. We found Miss Beatrice in the morning room, pale but composed, a shawl about her shoulders. Her eyes, large and dark, lit with both fear and resolve as she greeted us. I heard it clearly this time, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice low. 3 taps, deliberate as before. I dared not look, but Rose swears she saw a shadow move away across the garden. Holmes inclined his head gravely. "Your courage serves you well, Miss Marchbank. And what of your mother?" "She has grown worse," she admitted. "Dr. Verral insists she take more of his draught, but she resists it. She says it numbs her tongue." Holmes's eyes flickered at that. "A wise instinct," he said softly. "Tell her she is not to touch a drop until I say otherwise." We passed then into the drawing-room, where Lady Marchbank reclined upon a chaise, her hands trembling though she strove for composure. Verral stood at her side, his brows drawn. Holmes greeted her with a bow and then, without preamble, lifted the small vial from the doctor's case which lay upon the side table. "You urged this upon her again?" Holmes demanded. "It is but a mild soporific," Verral said stiffly. "She is overwrought. Rest would do her good." Holmes held the bottle to the light. Overwrought she may be, poisoned she shall not be. I have tasted this once and need not twice. Its bitterness would never let a patient sleep, only weaken her heart. No more, doctor. The man's colour rose. You overstep, sir. Holmes ignored him. He turned instead to Lestrade. Inspector, see that this vial is sealed and sent for analysis. The Yard's chemist will confirm what my tongue already knows. We may yet save Lady Marchbank from sharing her husband's fate. The atmosphere in the room was taut with unspoken accusations. Beatrice, standing behind her mother, clutched the shawl tighter. Verrill, biting back protest, began to pack his instruments with more force than delicacy. Holmes watched him a moment, then spoke in a tone deceptively mild. Doctor, you said you compounded this draft 3 days ago. Where did you leave it? In my surgery cabinet, Verrill replied. And who had access? Why, no one, save my assistant. But he is trustworthy. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Trust is often the first victim in such games. We shall have a word with him. Meanwhile, your duty is to your patient. Remain here until I return. Leaving the drawing room, Holmes guided us back toward the garden. The fog pressed close against the windows, and the lamps outside threw pale circles upon the lawn. Holmes unlatched the door and stepped out, lantern in hand. The ground, though hardened by frost, bore the faintest mark of a scuff. Neither a boot nor a slipper, but something flatter, broader, as though a man had padded across in felted shoes. There, Holmes said, crouching to trace the impression. He comes and goes with impunity. He knows this ground too well. He is not a stranger to the house. An accomplice within? I asked. Precisely. A door unlatched, a latch tampered. These are not the tricks of a thief, but of one who has the liberty of a guest. And his purpose is not robbery. It is terror. As he spoke, the lantern beam caught on something glinting in the grass. Holmes stooped and retrieved it. It was a sliver of metal curled like a shaving, sharp at one edge. He turned it delicately in his fingers. The same spring steel as before, he murmured. A tool filed for a locksmith's art. Our printer friend was not only a compositor, he was a craftsman of doors. He has tried this latch more than once, but he has not yet entered. Why? Because he works with another hand within. We returned indoors, Holmes silent in thought. In the hall Peters waited, his face pale. Sir, there is a messenger, he said. A boy no older than 12. He brought this note and vanished into the fog before we could question him. Holmes took the folded slip and opened it. The words printed as before leapt at us. The rook has struck twice. The game ends at dawn. Holmes's lips compressed. He read the message again, then looked at Lestrade. Inspector, set your men to guard this house without pause. No one enters, no one leaves. The enemy seeks to shake us with riddles, but his board grows narrow. At dawn he boasts the game ends. Very well. We shall be here when it does. He turned to me, his eyes alight with that fire of pursuit that made him terrible in such moments. Watson, tonight we keep watch. The rook has flown twice, but he will not escape a third. And so we settled in the lamplit gloom of Queen Anne Street, waiting for the unseen hand that had already struck down a master of finance and threatened his house with ruin. Outside the fog thickened, the lamps grew dim, and the silence pressed closer with every passing minute. As though the city itself held its breath for dawn, the long vigil began in silence, broken only by the creak of the house as it settled into uneasy slumber and the faint rustle of the fog against the panes. Holmes had chosen his post by the garden window in Sir Felix's dressing room, where the rook's taps had twice sounded. He sat with his sharp profile outlined against the lamp, every nerve taut, while Lestrade kept a grumbling watch in the corridor, and I hovered between them. Notebook in hand, though heaven knew my pen could do little against the danger that stalked us, Miss Beatrice had withdrawn with her mother, Peters stationed outside their chamber like a sentinel. The minutes passed heavily. Each time the clock struck, Holmes's eyes flickered, but he made no sound. At last, close upon 3, he moved suddenly, raising his hand in warning. From beyond the curtained sash came the faintest whisper, 3 taps deliberate, spaced as before. My heart leapt into my throat. Holmes extinguished the lamp with one swift gesture, plunging us into darkness save for the dull glow of the fire. He drew the curtain aside by a finger's breadth. I leaned close enough to see over his shoulder. Against the pale fog outside, a shadow detached itself. A figure crouched low, its arm extended toward the frame. A thin blade glimmered faintly in the starlight. Patience, Holmes breathed. He tests the latch again. The figure worked carefully, drawing the blade along the joint as before. A faint rasp reached us, then the click of the inner catch loosening. Holmes's hand closed on my arm with sudden pressure. "Now," he whispered, and threw the sash wide. The intruder started back with a stifled oath, but Holmes was upon him like a striking hawk, seizing his wrist and wrenching the tool away. Lestrade, roused by the scuffle, rushed in, and together we hauled the fellow bodily through the window into the dressing room. He struggled with a desperate fury, striking out with his free hand, but Holmes forced him down upon the carpet. The firelight showed us a gaunt man in a labourer's coat, his face smeared with soot, his fingers black with ink and oil. It was indeed the printer we had cornered at the club. "You should have stayed in custody," Holmes said grimly. "But the yard is not a rook's cage, it seems." Lestrade swore under his breath. "By heaven, it is the same man. Escaped his escort, no doubt. Well, he won't slip this time." Yet even as he said it, the fellow gave a low laugh that curdled my blood. "You think you've won, Mr. Holmes? The second stroke has already fallen. At dawn you'll see." "It's too late." Holmes's eyes burned like coals. "Speak, man, who aids you within these walls? For you do not strike alone." The prisoner clamped his mouth shut, his jaw set in iron defiance. Lestrade dragged him upright, cursing, and called for the constables below. Holmes, however, was not watching the man, but the tool that had clattered to the floor in the struggle. He stooped and lifted it. It was no ordinary blade, but a thin strip of spring steel filed to a hook at one end, its edges worn with use. "Made for a locksmith's art," Holmes murmured. "And see, Watson, the tip bears a smear of grease mixed with sugar dust. He has used it elsewhere in the house. The pantry latch, no doubt. He sought entry there for a reason." As Lestrade marched the prisoner out, Holmes remained kneeling, his gaze fixed upon the hearth. He brushed his fingers across the rug and brought them up glistening with the faintest trace of powder. "More sugar," he said, scattered deliberately. "A trail for one who knows how to read it. But who within this house would welcome such a sign?" Before I could answer, a cry rang down the corridor. It was Peters's voice, shrill with alarm. Holmes sprang to his feet and was out the door in an instant, I hard on his heels. We found Peters white as chalk outside Lady Marchbank's chamber. "Sir, she has swooned. And Miss Beatrice, she cannot rouse her." We entered to find Lady Marchbank lying limp upon the bed, her lips tinged with a faint bluish pallor. Beatrice knelt beside her, clasping her mother's hand, terror in her eyes. The physician's vial stood uncorked upon the table, a measure of liquid still within the glass beside it. Holmes bent over the patient, his nose close to her mouth, then felt her pulse with swift precision. Relief softened his features. "She lives," he said. "The dose was small, thank heaven, but the draught was tampered indeed. She has been poisoned, though not fatally." His gaze darted to the glass. "Watson, smell this." I obeyed, and the bitterness stung my nostrils at once. "The same taint as before." Holmes turned to Beatrice. "Who brought this to your mother?" She shook her head helplessly. I know not. I left her to fetch another shawl. When I returned, the glass was at her side. Then someone within this house placed it there while you were gone," Holmes said. "And it was not our printer friend, who was busy with the latch below. The rook plays his game with allies." Lestrade entered at that moment, breathing hard from his orders. "The fellow is secured, Holmes." "But what's this now?" Holmes's eyes gleamed in the lamplight. "This, Inspector, is the second stroke. Sir Felix fell at midnight. Lady Marchbank was meant to follow before dawn. The hand that brought the glass to her is the hand we seek, and it is nearer than any of them suspect." Beatrice looked up at him, her face pale but resolute. "Mr. Holmes, do you mean someone in this household is guilty?" "I mean," Holmes said gravely, "that no rook flies without a board to guide him. Tonight that board is this house. We must learn whose hand moves the piece before dawn breaks, or the game may claim yet another life." He drew the curtains wide, letting in the dim pallor of the fog-bound night. His voice, low but steely, carried a resolve that steadied even my own shaken nerves. "We shall keep watch, Watson. The end game is upon us. And the rook? The rook has not yet shown his final flight." Holmes stood by the window, the fog-drenched light limning his figure like a sentinel in bronze. He did not stir for several moments after pronouncing that grim observation, and in the silence I could hear the shallow breaths of Lady Marchbank, the faint ticking of the mantel clock, and Beatrice's subdued sob as she clutched her mother's hand. Lestrade shifted restlessly, muttering that the prisoner in custody was enough to hang the case upon, but Holmes turned from the glass with a sharpness that cut through our weariness. "No, Inspector. Our printer is but the rook, a piece that moves straight across the board at command. The hand we seek belongs to the player who moves him, and until we identify that intelligence, the game remains unfinished." He stooped suddenly and examined the shawl Beatrice had fetched earlier, still draped over the back of a chair. His long fingers pinched at its fringe, then released it. "Dust," he murmured. "Grey, fine, not from this room. Likely from the pantry passage. You said you left to fetch this, Miss Marchbank?" She nodded, surprised. "Yes, my mother complained of the chill. And the door stood open when you returned?" "Yes, slightly ajar." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "So the shawl was the pretext. While you fetched it, another entered here unobserved and placed the poisoned draught. An ally working from within the household, Peters." The butler appeared nervous and pale, but dignified still. Holmes fixed him with a gaze that seemed to peel away his composure layer by layer. "Who else had liberty of the upper floor at that hour?" "No one, sir," Peters said at once, though his voice wavered. "The maids were below. The cook had gone to her bed, and I kept to the corridor outside." Holmes's lips curved faintly. "So you were in two places at once, the corridor, and if the dust on this shawl tells truth, the pantry passage. Unless, of course, you admit to letting another slip by?" The man's face flushed crimson. "I let no one pass, sir. I swear it." Holmes regarded him a long moment, then turned away without comment. He crossed to Lady Marchbank and bent low, speaking softly so only we two could hear. "She must have broth. Plain, warm, nothing from the physician's bottle. See that Rose prepares it." He straightened and addressed us all. "Now, gentlemen, we shall adjourn to Sir Felix's study. There is a matter yet unopened which may show us the motive, without which we grope in the dark." We followed him down to the ground floor, to a handsome chamber lined with books and heavy ledgers. On the desk lay piles of correspondence, some opened, others sealed. Holmes rifled quickly through them, his keen eye leaping from line to line. At last he drew out a packet of papers tied with a faded blue ribbon. "Here," he said, laying them flat. "Promissory notes, mortgages, the record of Marchbank's dealings. Observe, Watson, how many bear the same counter-signature, Mortlake. And here others with names of lesser men, all tied to the Erebus Club. Marchbank was the spider at the centre, drawing their means to himself until they hung helpless." Lestrade whistled softly. "So that's why Mortlake quailed at sight of you. He knew he was next to fall." "Exactly. But note further, this parchment older yellowed, a will. Not Marchbank's, his brother's. And look, an alteration in another hand. The residue of the estate diverted not to Beatrice, but to Lady Marchbank. Interesting. Sir Felix profited by more than finance. He profited by forgery," I started. "Then his death benefits the lady most?" Holmes's eyes flicked to me, thoughtful. "Perhaps, or perhaps it serves one who would see her accused. Remember, the draft was pressed upon her by Verrill, but delivered by another. And she, poor woman, lies now insensible." He leaned closer to the papers, then lifted his head with sudden decision. "Watson, keep these safe. Lestrade, recall your men from the club and set them at each exit here. No one stirs till dawn. The rook is struck twice, but the player grows reckless. He will move again." The hours that followed passed in a tension I can scarcely describe. Holmes paced the study with a noiseless tread, his gaze flitting often to the door as though awaiting an unseen signal. I dozed once in the armchair, roused by the scrape of his violin as he drew a single note to sharpen his thoughts. Beatrice entered once, pale but composed, and begged leave to sit with her mother. Holmes allowed it, though his eyes lingered on her with unreadable intensity. At length, just as the first faint paling of dawn touched the window, a cry shattered the silence. It came from the upper floor, a woman's voice, high with terror. We rushed upstairs, Lestrade at the fore. Peters stood by Lady Marchbank's chamber door, white as chalk, his hands raised as if to ward off accusation. Inside, Beatrice was on her knees, clutching the bedclothes. Lady Marchbank stirred faintly, alive still, but on the floor by the window lay a shattered glass. The acrid odour of the poison stung the air. Holmes strode across the room in 2 long steps. He bent, touched the spill, and brought his fingers to his nose. His eyes hardened. The same tincture. The hand grows bold indeed. This was poured not an hour ago. Beatrice looked up at him wild-eyed. "But I was here. No one entered, no one. Holmes raised the empty glass between finger and thumb. And yet someone placed this beside her. We are very close now. The rook makes its final flight. But mark me, this is no longer a game of chance. One more move and the hand will reveal itself. He turned to Lestrade, his voice like steel. Keep guard at this chamber. Watson, bring the papers. Before the sun clears the fog, we shall force the culprit into checkmate. The time has come. And with that, Holmes swept from the room, the dawn light painting his figure in stark silhouette, as though the rising sun itself had chosen to follow him into the endgame. Holmes led the way to the study once more, his stride long and determined, the packet of papers tucked under my arm as though they were more dangerous than the poison itself. The first pale bands of daylight pressed faintly through the fog, and I could see the relief on Lestrade's face at the thought that night had at last yielded. Yet Holmes's manner told me that the true peril had only now arrived. He shut the door behind us and motioned me to lay the documents upon the desk. He spread them carefully, aligning the pages as though the order of their arrangement might summon the truth. Then he turned suddenly to Peters, who hovered at the threshold, still pale from the commotion above. "You are devoted to this household, Peters," Holmes said evenly. "So I would do much to preserve its reputation." "I would, sir," the butler replied, his voice low. "Would you do murder?" The man recoiled as though struck. "Never, sir." "I swear on my soul, never." Holmes watched him closely, then gave a small nod. "We shall see." He beckoned Lestrade and me nearer and pointed to one of the ledgers. "Observe here. Marchbank's dealings were not merely extortionate, but fraudulent. He held notes belonging to Mortlake, yes, but also to the very physician he trusted. Dr. Verrill, see the figures. Debts concealed beneath medical expenses, interest compounded until ruin was certain. Verrill, too, was ensnared in Marchbank's web. If the man sought escape, what easier way than to hasten his creditor to the grave? Lestrade swore under his breath. "So the doctor is at the root?" Holmes shook his head. "Too simple. Our printer, the Rook, was engaged by another. Verrill may have tampered with the draft, but he is not cunning enough to weave riddles in print. Someone else used him, just as they used the boy messenger and the pawn in the garden. No, Inspector, the hand lies higher and closer." At that moment a soft step sounded outside. The door opened and Beatrice entered, her face drawn but resolute. She held a folded sheet in her hand. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "this was slipped beneath my door just now. I thought it best you see it." He took it swiftly, his eyes narrowing as he unfolded the paper. The words were printed in the same severe type. "The Queen must fall before the sun is high." "Then the game is done." Holmes read it aloud, his voice grim. "The Queen, Lady Marchbank. This confirms what we already know." He turned the sheet over, then gave a sharp cry of satisfaction. "At last he grows careless. See, Watson, the impression upon the back, not from a press this time, but from a hand stamp. And this mark, ink smudged with a trace of oil, precisely the blend we found upon the shawl. Our player prints his threats within this very house." Beatrice's lips parted in shock. "But who here would dare?" Holmes's gaze moved from her to Peters, then past him to the shadowed corridor beyond. "One who moves freely between rooms, who touches every object, who knows when the family sleeps and when they wake. A servant, yes, but one with greater motive. Peters, who inherits when Lady Marchbank is gone." The butler faltered. I cannot say, sir." "Surely, Miss Beatrice—" Holmes's voice cut across him. "Not so. These papers reveal that a portion of the estate, funds concealed from the daughter, was set aside in trust for one long in service to the house. A faithful servant rewarded beyond measure. And with Sir Felix gone, only the lady's hand could release it. That servant could not wait. He sought to quicken the hand by ending the life." Peters's face drained of colour. "You cannot mean—" But Lestrade stepped forward, his jaw set. "Holmes, are you saying—" Holmes held up a finger. "Patience, Inspector. He will betray himself soon enough. For the Rook cannot fly alone. The hand must move it. And dawn is upon us." As if to echo his words, the clock struck 6. A faint glow penetrated the fog outside, limning the window with silver. At that instant a commotion rose above. The hurried patter of feet, the cry of Rose the maid, then the thud of something heavy falling. Holmes leapt for the stairs and we followed in a rush. In Lady Marchbank's chamber we found chaos. The curtains were half torn, the bedclothes disordered, and Peters stood by the bed with a glass in his hand. Lady Marchbank lay against the pillows, her lips parted in fright. Beatrice clung to her mother, crying out. Holmes advanced, his voice like a whip. "Drop it, Peters!" The butler froze, the glass trembling in his hand. His eyes darted from Holmes to Lestrade, then to Beatrice. For an instant I thought he might drink the draught himself, but with a groan he let it fall. The liquid spattered harmlessly upon the carpet. Lestrade seized him by the arms, and the man collapsed without resistance. "I only meant to finish what was begun," he muttered hoarsely. "It was promised me, the trust, the estate. Marchbank swore I should never want. But with him dead and her clinging to life, it would all slip away." Holmes stooped to retrieve the fallen glass, holding it gingerly. "Poison again. Sugar and salt to mask the bitterness. You grew bold, Peters, when you believed the fog your ally. But you forgot that the rook does not rule the board. It serves the player. And in your greed you revealed yourself." Lady Marchbank, trembling, whispered, "He has been with us 20 years. "I cannot believe," Holmes bowed gravely. "Believe it, madam. Devotion is often the mask of ambition. Your household has been preserved at a terrible cost, but preserved nonetheless." Lestrade hauled the wretched man to his feet. Peters's head drooped, his face grey with defeat. "Take him," Holmes said. "The game is done." Yet as dawn broke fully and the fog began to lift, I could not shake the image of that printed letter, its final words still burning in my mind. For though the rook had fallen and the queen been spared, Holmes's eyes remained distant, as though he sensed another hand still hidden upon the board, waiting for its move. The fog thinned as the morning grew, and with it came a brittle quiet that seemed less relief than exhaustion. Peters had been taken away, his bowed head and limp frame betraying the collapse of a man whose long years of service had soured into bitter ambition. Lestrade, satisfied enough to claim his victory, spoke already of papers to be drawn and evidence sealed. Yet Holmes did not share in that air of finality. He stood by the window of the Marchbank drawing-room, his thin figure outlined by the weak daylight, and his eyes held that same distant gleam I had come to know too well. Too well. "You are not content, Holmes," I said softly. "And yet the matter seems concluded." Peters confessed. "The evidence lies plain." Holmes did not turn. "Confession, Watson, is a treacherous reed. Men confess from despair as often as from guilt entire. Peters played his part, yes, but the hand that printed those letters, that devised the rook's riddle and moved him upon the board, that hand is not his. He is no strategist. He is a pawn promoted by circumstance, nothing more." Lestrade bristled. "A pawn? He tried to poison her ladyship." "That's enough for the gallows." "Enough for the gallows, perhaps," Holmes replied, "but not enough for the truth. Consider, the printer who left sugar dust and graphite upon the latch, the boy who delivered letters, the composition of type so neat and deliberate. Peters had neither access to such means nor wit to fashion them. He was tempted by promise of gain, but he was not the architect. No, Inspector, the mind that designed this game is still at large, and until we name him, the danger lingers." Even as he spoke, Peters's earlier words returned to me with a chill. It was promised me, the trust, the estate. Promised by whom? Holmes turned suddenly, his gaze alighting upon the packet of documents I had guarded. He spread them once more across the desk. "Watson, recall the parchment we examined, the altered will of Sir Felix's brother. It named Lady Marchbank as beneficiary in place of her daughter. Curious, is it not, that Beatrice, whose loyalty to her mother seems beyond doubt, should have been excluded? That alteration, my friends, was no accident. It is the key." Beatrice, who had entered quietly, started at his words. Her face blanched, but she stood her ground. "Mr. Holmes, I do not understand. My father, he arranged it perhaps, but why should that matter now?" Holmes regarded her with a grave intensity. "Because the alteration served to sow mistrust. Who benefits if suspicion falls upon Lady Marchbank? Who gains if she is thought to have poisoned her husband and nearly herself in pursuit of an inheritance? Only one who wishes to control both fortune and reputation, to stand clear while ruin consumes the house." Her lips parted, and for the first time a flicker of fear crossed her composure. "You cannot mean—" "I mean," Holmes said slowly, "that the forger of that will is the same who printed the letters, a man of type and ink, of accounts and cunning, one who haunted both the club and this household, under guise of friendship. Sir Felix's rival and debtor, Mortlake." Lestrade swore aloud. "Mortlake! but we questioned him at the club and found him restless, waiting, his paper unread, his glass untouched. He is not a victim, Inspector, but a conspirator. He engaged the printer, set Peters to his task, and orchestrated the very warnings that lured us to chase shadows while he sought to complete the ruin of the Marchbanks. The rook flew in fog, yes, but the king sat at the board all along. At that instant a knock sounded at the door. A constable entered, cap in hand. "Inspector, there's news from the yard. The printer we secured escaped his escort once more, slipped them near Blackfriars before dawn." Holmes's mouth tightened. "As I expected. A man does not laugh at capture, unless he knows his master will soon reclaim him. Mortlake has no doubt arranged it. He means to silence his tool before we can extract the truth." Lestrade cursed and strode for the hall. "I'll have men on Mortlake's house within the hour." Holmes lifted a hand. "Not so. Mortlake is too clever to sit waiting. He will move now before daylight exposes him. He will strike either at the club to destroy the records or here to finish the Marchbanks. We must anticipate him." Beatrice's voice trembled. "Mr. Holmes, if he means harm still—" Holmes turned to her, his tone softened. "Fear not, Miss Marchbank. The game nears its close. Mortlake has made one miscalculation, and it lies in that very will. He trusted the forgery would remain undiscovered. But the ink betrays him. Modern ink upon old parchment. At dawn, with light sufficient, I can prove it. That proof will bind him tighter than any confession. I saw then the fierce light in Holmes's eyes, and I knew he was already setting the final snare. The hours that followed were swift with preparation. Holmes directed constables to remain hidden about the house, Peters's confession notwithstanding. He instructed me to guard the documents with my very life, and he himself vanished into the fog for nearly an hour, returning with the look of one who had seen his quarry take the bait. By the time the sun rose higher, the mist thinning into pale bands, a knock sounded again at the Marchbank door. Peters's replacement admitted Mortlake himself, his manner outwardly grave, his condolences offered with the easy smoothness of a man rehearsed. He inquired after Lady Marchbank, expressed regret for Sir Felix, and at last asked to speak with Miss Beatrice alone. Holmes stepped forward before she could reply. "You shall have that privilege, Mr. Mortlake, but in the study and under my observation. The time has come for your rook to roost." Mortlake's eyes flickered, a shadow of unease beneath his polished composure. He inclined his head, but I saw the faint tightening of his jaw. He followed us in silence to the study, where the documents lay waiting. Holmes gestured to the parchment. "This, sir, is the will of Sir Felix's brother, altered to divert the estate. The alteration was made with modern ink, from a hand skilled in type but careless of chemistry. That hand is yours, Mortlake, and it is the same hand that printed the letters, devised the riddles, and moved Peters to strike." Mortlake's mask did not falter, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of fury. "You overreach, Holmes. Such accusations—" "Will be proved," Holmes cut in, "before the day is done. You set the rook upon the board, Mortlake, but you forgot the bishop that cuts across unseen lines. Can't I tell you now your game is ended?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch with the tension of drawn steel. Then Mortlake gave a thin smile, but his hand strayed toward the papers as though to seize or destroy them. Holmes moved like lightning, intercepting him with a grasp iron strong. "Not yet, Mortlake," he said. "The sun is risen. The fog is gone. And so is your concealment." And as Lestrade stepped forward with his men, I knew the board at last was set for its final move. Mortlake's hand twitched in Holmes's grasp, his polished composure fraying at last. For a moment he struggled like a fish caught on a line. Then, realizing the futility, he straightened and attempted to cloak himself once more in hauteur. "You cannot prove a thing," he sneered. "An ink blot, a smudge on paper. Hardly the gallows, Holmes." Holmes released him abruptly as though the man were unworthy of his hold. "On the contrary, you have already betrayed yourself. Peters may have placed the poisoned glass, but it was your hand that forged the will and paid the printer for his nocturnal errands. The press marks on the letters match precisely with specimens I obtained this very morning from the small workshop you frequent in Southwark." The owner, bribed into silence, was glad enough to speak when pressed. "Add to that your debts to Marchbank, your presence at the club with unread paper and untouched glass, and your attempted destruction of these documents but a moment ago. Need I heap more upon the scales?" Lestrade stepped in with a triumphant snort. "That's enough for me, Holmes. Mortlake, you'll come with us, But Holmes held up a hand. "One moment, Inspector. Let us not rob Mr. Mortlake of the satisfaction of seeing his clever scheme laid bare. He devised it as a game, and a game deserves its reckoning. Mortlake's eyes flashed, half with fury, half with a strange pride. "If you fancy yourself my opponent, Holmes, then by all means display the board. But remember, even the best players sometimes overlook a move." Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed. Let us examine the game as it stands. Sir Felix, a financier of dubious honor, held your debts and those of many others. Exposure meant ruin. You conceived not only to free yourself but to profit. By striking him down at midnight with a poison easily mistaken for apoplexy, you cleared the first obstacle. But you knew suspicion might fall on the family, so you contrived the letters, riddling threats printed in a hand designed to distract us. A rook flying in fog. Clever enough, I could not restrain myself. And Peters?" Holmes nodded. "The butler was your instrument, bribed with promises of trust money that never truly existed. You used his loyalty to the house as a lever, until greed toppled it into betrayal. He placed the draft at Lady Marchbank's side, hoping to finish what you began, while your printer kept us chasing phantoms in the garden. But Peters was too clumsy, too bound by habit. His failure betrayed him." Mortlake's lips curled. "And yet it was nearly successful. Another hour and the lady would have succumbed." "Nearly," Holmes agreed, "but not quite. For you overlooked the taste of your poison, a bitterness impossible to disguise. Lady Marchbank resisted, and suspicion fell upon your tool. That was your blunder, Mortlake. You trusted pawns to deliver checkmate. Lestrade's men moved to take him, but Mortlake gave a sudden violent wrench and dashed toward the hearth. His hand snatched at the fire-iron, and for a breathless instant it seemed he would turn weapon. Holmes, however, was quicker. He intercepted the arm, twisting it with clean precision, until the iron clattered harmlessly to the floor. "Your final move, Mortlake," he said coldly. And it failed. Beatrice, who had stood pale and silent throughout, let out a sob of mingled relief and horror. "So it was you," she whispered. "You who ruined my father and sought to destroy us all." Mortlake turned on her with venom. "Your father ruined himself. I merely hastened justice. And had you any wit, girl, you would thank me for cutting away the rot." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Enough, Inspector, take him." Lestrade snapped the order and the constables closed in. Mortlake, drained of resistance, allowed himself to be led away, though his eyes lingered on Holmes with a curious fire. "You play well, Holmes," he said softly as they dragged him to the door. "But beware, the board is larger than even you can see." The door shut behind them and silence settled upon the study. Beatrice clung to her mother, who had been brought down with gentle care, and Peters's earlier confession seemed already a shadow in the wake of Mortlake's capture. Holmes, however, did not relax. He stood at the desk, his gaze resting on the forged will, as though it were a piece of evidence still whispering secrets. "At last," I said. "The matter is concluded." Holmes turned, and the faintest smile touched his lips. "Concluded, Watson, perhaps, yet I cannot help but feel that Mortlake's final words hold some truth. The board is indeed larger than we see. His game is ended, but the pattern of such intrigue stretches far across London's web of finance and corruption. Still, for now, justice has its due." Lady Marchbank lifted her eyes to him, gratitude shining through her weakness. "Mr. Holmes, how can we thank you? You have saved us from a fate I scarce dare imagine." Holmes bowed slightly, his manner distant yet respectful. "Madam, I ask no thanks. The pursuit of truth is its own reward. But take care. The stain of your husband's dealings may linger. Best that these papers be consigned to the law, where their poison may be purged." Beatrice spoke then, her voice steady despite her pallor. "And Peters, what will become of him?" Holmes's expression softened. "He will answer for his actions, but I think the law will see his weakness rather than his malice. He was but a servant seduced by promises beyond his grasp." Mortlake was the true hand. The morning sun broke fully through the thinning fog, casting long beams across the chamber. Holmes drew the curtains wide, letting the light fall upon the desk, the papers, and the weary faces of those who had endured the night's peril. "It is over," he said simply. "The rook has flown, the queen is spared, and the king removed from the board. The game is finished." And with that he gathered his coat about him and moved for the door. I followed, pausing only to glance back at the Marchbank women, who sat together in the fragile calm of survival. As we stepped into the clear air of morning, London stirred to life around us, its streets washed in pale gold. Beside me, Holmes lit his pipe, his keen profile serene at last. "Another case, Watson," he murmured. "A game of shadows, a puzzle of ink and ambition. Let us hope the next affords less poison and more air for the lungs. Though," and here his eyes gleamed with sudden humour, "I suspect the rooks of London will always find fog enough in which to fly." The cab bore us back toward Baker Street, its wheels clattering over cobblestones still wet with fog. For some time neither Holmes nor I spoke. He smoked in silence, the faint wreaths curling about his sharp features, while my thoughts dwelt upon the Marchbank household. Shaken, yet spared, at last I ventured, "Holmes, when did you first suspect Mortlake?" He exhaled a thin stream of smoke. "From the beginning, Watson. The first letter, with its compositor's ink and chessboard conceit, betrayed a mind too disciplined for mere mischief. Mortlake sat at the club with a newspaper he never read, a glass he never touched, waiting not in fear but in calculation. Yet to accuse him outright would have been folly. I required proof, the altered will, the type from Southwark, the final attempt upon Lady Marchbank. Each was a rook's flight, and together they formed the game entire. And Peters?" I asked. Holmes's gaze grew distant. "Peters was weak, not wicked. Mortlake dangled before him the promise of fortune, and the man, long in service and grown weary, grasped at it. He became both pawn and scapegoat. Such men are dangerous in their blindness, but not in their design. The true peril lay always with Mortlake." I reflected on this. The riddle of loyalty turned to treachery, and shook my head. "It is astonishing, Holmes, how near he came to success." "Astonishing, yes," Holmes murmured, "but instructive. Mortlake believed he could manipulate us, as he manipulated his pieces. Yet he forgot that while pawns may move blindly, the board itself leaves traces. The dust upon a shawl, the bitterness in a draught, the modern ink upon an old parchment. These are the voices of truth, Watson, and they cannot be silenced." We arrived at Baker Street as the morning sun banished the last shreds of mist. Mrs. Hudson, much put out at our nocturnal departure, fussed over us until Holmes, with rare patience, assured her no harm had come. Then he cast himself into his chair, stretching his long legs before the fire. "You see, Watson," he said, "it is never enough to seize the rook or to corner the queen. One must see the hand that moves them. That is the essence of detection. And you, Holmes," I replied with feeling, "are the finest player of all." He gave a short laugh, half amusement, half dismissal. "A player, perhaps. But the game itself is endless, my dear fellow. London breeds 1,000 boards, each foggier than the last. Mortlake's scheme is but one among many. Yet," and here he tapped the ash from his pipe, "to unravel such designs is a diversion not without its charms." With that he leaned back, eyes half closed, already retreating into that silent realm where his mind, ever restless, turned shadows into patterns and enigmas into solutions. And I, pen in hand, resolved to set down the tale while its smoke yet lingered in my memory, that others might marvel at the strange affair we would forever recall as the case of the letter that arrived after midnight.